When the envelope came in the mail, I recognized Mason's handwriting right away. Neat, slanted just enough to show care, but not pretension. I stood in the kitchen, holding it for longer than I should have, the edges of the envelope soft against the calloused pads of my thumbs. My name was written clean across the front, Dad, in that careful, deliberate script. No address needed. He knew to get to me. It was the kind of envelope people send good news in. Celebration news. Wedding news. And I couldn't open it. Not because I wasn't happy for him. I was. I'd raised that boy from diapers to degrees, every scraped knee and high school heartbreak, every call about deadlines and rent. I'd watched him grow into a man with a spine and a conscience, someone better than me in all the ways I'd hoped he'd be. But when that envelope came, all I could think about was the suit I didn't own, the shoes I couldn't afford to replace, the kind of smile I'd have to practice in a mirror just to keep from showing how out of place I'd feel. Mason was marrying into a family that used napkins you had to iron. His fiancée, Sophie, came from people with ski homes and wine cellars, folks who used summer as a verb. Her dad owned some logistics firm with offices in 4 states. I met him once, firm handshake, polite smile, but a gaze that slid right past me. The kind of man who probably didn't mean to look down on someone like me, but couldn't help it. I've been working at the machine plant since I was 23. 30 years of noise and grease and 12-hour shifts. I'd never had a vacation longer than a weekend. My boots had holes I patched with duct tape. I made sure Mason never saw the worst of it. He went to college on scholarships, worked part-time, graduated without owing a cent. I remember the day he got his first real job offer in Chicago. Entry-level, but salaried. He called me crying. Said he couldn't have done it without me. I remember smiling so hard it hurt. I didn't let him hear the silence that came after. The truth was, I'd always known he'd outgrow the world I came from. I just didn't expect it to hurt like this. So I left the envelope on the kitchen counter for days. I'd walk past it on the way to the fridge, glance at it while eating dinner over the sink. My hands would twitch like they wanted to tear it open, but my chest would lock up. I didn't know if the invitation meant I was wanted there, or if it was just obligation. A name on a list. A line of text that said, Father of the Groom, but felt like a title I no longer recognized. The first time I met Grace's parents, I shook Douglas Whitmore's hand and knew instantly he'd already made his mind up about me. It was the way he looked at my fingers, grease-stained, no matter how many times I scrubbed them with lava soap. The way his lips barely curved when he said my name. His suit cost more than my truck. I could tell from the shine of the shoes and the way he stood, like he owned whatever room he was in. Helen wasn't much better. She was polite, sure, but cold. Her eyes scanned me like she was reading a resume that didn't measure up. We met at their home, if you could call it that. It looked more like a museum. Marble countertops, art on the walls I didn't recognize, one I couldn't pronounce. I wore my best shirt, the one with the collar that never sat right, and I brought a bottle of something I've been told was decent. But I could feel in the air the moment I stepped inside. I didn't belong. Grace was kind, genuinely. She greeted me with warmth, kissed my cheek, said she was glad I could come. But even as I smiled, I felt like a prop in someone else's play. Everything about their world was precise, smooth, intentional. The forks were lined up straight on linen napkins. No mismatched chairs or chipped mugs. No dust on the baseboards. They asked what I did, and when I told them I worked as a floor supervisor at the plant, Douglas nodded once, then moved on. No follow-up, no curiosity. It was like I'd said I worked in a different century. Helen asked where I studied, and when I said I had a GED, she blinked as if she hadn't heard me right. Then she smiled the way people smile when they feel sorry for you but don't want to say it. I didn't mention the nights I spent packing Mason's lunch for double shifts, or how I sat beside him on the couch when his first investor backed out, or how I pawned my watch to help him buy his first server. I didn't talk about the years I spent skipping meals so he could eat better, or how I used to iron his shirts for career fairs, even though I hadn't ironed a thing for myself in decades. None of that would have meant anything to them. They saw a man with oil on his hands and a cheap belt around his waist, and figured that was the whole story. Mason sat between us, trying to bridge the worlds, but I saw it in his eyes, that flicker of apology, like he wished I could fit in better, like he hated that I had to be the one they didn't understand. I didn't blame him. He'd worked so hard to get here. Built his startup from scratch, fueled by ramen and code and too much coffee. He'd earned everything, but they didn't see that. They saw his ambition and chalked it up to Grace's influence, her family, her circle. They didn't know that the kid they praised now used to cry himself to sleep over algebra until I learned enough to help him through it. Back at my place that night, I sat in the silence above the hardware store and looked around at my life. The old recliner with the ripped arm, the framed photo of Mason in his cap and gown, the sagging shelf with books I never finished. I didn't feel ashamed, but I did feel small, like no matter how hard I tried, I still wasn't enough to be seen in the world my son now lived in. I arrived at the Hamilton estate feeling like a fraud in someone else's life. The rented suit stiff at the shoulders, and the shoes already chewing into the backs of my heels, each step a reminder that nothing about this day was built for someone like me. The place looked unreal. White stone and trimmed hedges and windows, so tall they reflected the sky back at itself. And I remember thinking that Mason had always dreamed big, just never this far away from where we started. I told myself to stand up straight, to keep my hands out of my pockets, to look like I belonged even if my body knew better. Inside, everything smelled like flowers and money. Voices echoed softly, controlled laughter, the kind that never gets too loud. I looked for Mason first, because he was the only anchor I had in that room. But before I could find him, a woman with a clipboard stepped in front of me. She didn't smile. She didn't ask how I was. She just scanned her list, nodded once, and said my name like she was checking off a delivery. Then she turned and gestured for me to follow. She led me past the front rows where men in tailored suits and women in dresses that probably cost more than my yearly rent sat chatting comfortably. People who looked like they'd known each other for decades through boards and conferences and universities I'd only seen on TV. We kept walking, further back, until the music sounded a little duller and a large column blocked part of the view. She stopped at a round table tucked just far enough away that it felt intentional. My brother Chuck was there, already seated, tugging at his collar. The old babysitter who used to watch Mason when I worked night shifts gave me a small, sympathetic smile. An old neighbor I hadn't seen in years nodded at me like we were all in on the same quiet joke. This was the table for people like us, the ones who didn't fit the picture but couldn't be left out completely. I reached for my place card, expecting nothing more than my name, but when I read it, something inside my chest went hollow. Printed in careful, elegant calligraphy were words that didn't belong on any piece of paper, let alone at my son's wedding. Frank Dawson, low-educated factory worker. Not real dad. I read it again, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me, hoping I'd misunderstood, but the ink didn't change. My hand shook as I set the car back down. No one said anything. Maybe they hadn't seen it yet, or maybe they had and didn't know what to do. I felt heat crawl up my neck, a mix of humiliation and disbelief so sharp it made my ears ring. I thought about the nights Mason slept on my chest when he was sick, the mornings I walked him to school, the years it was just the two of us against the world, and I realized that somewhere along the way, none of that counted anymore. I stayed in my seat, back straight, eyes forward, because leaving would have hurt him, and staying hurt me, and I chose the pain I could carry quietly. Chuck saw the car before I could stop him, his thick fingers lifting it off the table, his face going from confused to red in about half a second, and I remember him sucking in a sharp breath like he was about to explode. He muttered something under his breath that sounded a lot like a curse, and then louder, too loud, asked what the hell this was supposed to mean, his voice cutting through the soft music and polite chatter like a blade. Chairs shifted. Heads turned. Conversations around us slowed and then stopped altogether, the silence spreading outward as people noticed something was wrong. I wanted to grab his arm, tell him to sit down, tell him it didn't matter, but the truth was it mattered more than anything ever had. I could feel eyes on me from every direction, curious, judgmental, entertained. I saw Douglas Whitmore glance over with a tight little smile that didn't reach his eyes, and Helen leaned in toward him, whispering something I couldn't hear, her expression calm, satisfied. Grace's brother, Evan, didn't even bother to hide it. He looked straight at the card, then at me, and laughed. A short, amused sound like this was exactly the kind of entertainment he'd expected. I stayed seated because my legs wouldn't move. My body felt heavy, like it had decided on its own that standing would be too much. All I could think about were the years that led to this moment. The mornings I skipped breakfast so Mason could have seconds. The overtime I turned down so I could sit in a tiny chair at parent-teacher conferences. The way I washed the same work uniform for nearly a decade because buying a new one meant cutting into money I'd set aside for his school supplies. I remembered standing in the cold outside his first apartment because I didn't want to track dirt inside, proud just to see his name on the mailbox. And now all of that had been reduced to 4 words printed neatly on a piece of cardstock. Not real dad. I've been called a lot of things in my life, most of them behind my back, but that one landed somewhere deeper, like it was trying to erase something fundamental, like it was telling the room that whatever I'd been to Mason didn't count. I felt small in a way I hadn't felt since his mother walked out, and left me holding a 2-year-old who didn't understand why his world had just split in half. I was already thinking about slipping away quietly, about leaving before Mason ever had to see this, when I heard his voice say my name, sharp with confusion and concern, and I looked up to see him standing there, his eyes locked on me, the smile he'd been wearing gone completely. I watched Mason pick up the card like it was burning in his hands. His jaw tightened, his whole body stiffened, and I knew before he even turned that something inside him had snapped. He didn't say anything to me. He didn't ask questions. He just walked, steady and sure, past the sea of stunned faces and linen-draped tables, straight to the head table where Grace was sitting in her pearl-white dress, surrounded by people who hadn't lifted a finger to raise him. His voice rang out across the room, clear and sharp. "Grace," he said, holding the card up for all to see. "Did you know about this?" She looked confused at first, blinking, eyes flicking from a card to him, to the people watching. "What?" she asked. "No. What is it?" He showed her, and I saw her face change. She looked at the card like it might explode, then back at him. "No," she said quickly. "No, I didn't. I swear, Mason, I didn't write that. I had no idea." Her voice cracked a little. Maybe it was real panic or just shame. But it was her mother who spoke next, and it was her voice that set the whole thing off. Helen leaned forward, one arm resting elegantly on the table, and smiled like this was all beneath her. "It was just a joke," she said, calm, measured, like she was explaining something to a child. "Don't overreact." Mason didn't blink. "A joke." His voice dropped, low and dangerous. "You think printing not real dad on a place card is a joke? You insulted the man who raised me. The man who worked himself into the ground so I could eat, so I could sleep safe, so I could have a future. You mocked the only real parent I've ever had." No one spoke. The room had frozen. I saw Douglas stand up then, trying to salvage the moment with that same firm smile he always wore when pretending to be reasonable. "Let's not make a scene," he said. "You know we've contributed a lot to this day, son." Mason laughed, a sound that didn't carry any humor. "You think your money gives you the right to humiliate my father," he said. "That because you paid for flowers and canapes, you get to rewrite my history? You didn't raise me. You didn't show up to my school plays or wait in the ER when I broke my arm. That man did." He pointed toward me, and I couldn't breathe. Then Mason ripped off his tuxedo jacket, dropped it on the floor without care, and walked back to where I was still sitting in stunned silence. His eyes locked on mine. "Let's go, Dad," he said. Just like that. No hesitation. No shame. Just truth. I stood up slowly. My knees felt weak, and my heart was pounding in my chest. But I followed him, past the silence, past the whispers, past the people who'd spent the whole night looking at me like I didn't belong. I walked beside my son, and for the first time that day, I felt taller than every man in that room. The morning after the wedding that never was, I sat at my kitchen table still in disbelief, the rented shoes by the door scuffed and stiff, my suit jacket draped over the back of a chair. My phone rang around 9 a.m., an unknown number flashing on the screen. I nearly ignored it, thinking it was a vendor wanting the suit back, or someone calling to gossip about the chaos from last night. But something told me to pick up. The woman on the line introduced herself as Lillian Brooks, managing partner at Whitmore & Associates. Her voice was crisp, professional, but not unkind. She asked if I could come to the office immediately. I drove in silence, my hands tight on the wheel, trying to make sense of it. What business did I have at a skyscraper firm where everyone probably had degrees I couldn't pronounce? When I arrived, they were expecting me. A receptionist greeted me by name and led me through a maze of polished halls and glass doors. I felt out of place again, boots clean but worn, shirt slightly wrinkled from where I'd folded it over a chair last night. Lillian was waiting behind a sleek desk, tall, composed, but her expression held something close to respect. She motioned for me to sit and got right to it. Mason had come in early that morning with a folder, a USB drive, and a list of names. He hadn't just walked out of his wedding. He'd walked into a boardroom with evidence. Audio files, transcripts, copies of emails, and internal memos. They detailed months of targeted sabotage. The Whitmores, Douglas and Helen, had used their weight in the firm to block a $2.5 million contract from going to Mason's company. The reason, written in a flagged internal note, was due to optics, followed by a parenthetical, family background, blue-collar father, no formal education. Lillian showed me part of an email where Helen had personally approved the printing of the nameplate card using firm funds. It had been formatted and printed by a junior staffer, instructed not to ask questions. There were audio clips too, Douglas in a meeting suggesting Mason's personal image might affect investor confidence. Helen joking about scrubbing the grease out of the family photos. I sat there listening to pieces of my life turned into punchlines. My boots, my hands, my entire existence, used as reasons to discredit my son. But Mason hadn't stayed silent. He'd compiled it all, quietly and methodically, over months. Lillian said his file had been damning enough to trigger an immediate internal investigation. Douglas and Helen had both been placed on administrative leave, pending review. Legal was involved. HR was involved. Reputation damage, she said, was imminent. She looked me in the eye then, and said something I wasn't expecting. Your son didn't just stand up for you last night. He exposed something we've ignored for far too long. I didn't say much. I don't think I could have. My throat felt tight. I wasn't used to people speaking my name in places like this, especially not with respect. And yet, in a glass tower filled with people nothing like me, my son had made them listen. He hadn't just defended me. He held them accountable. He didn't let my life be the punchline. He made it the proof. I never expected to see the day when people like Douglas and Helen Whitmore would face consequences. People like that. Rich, connected, polished. They usually land on their feet no matter how hard they fall. But this time they didn't. After Lillian Brooks launched the internal investigation, it moved faster than I ever thought a place like that could move. Within 48 hours, both Douglas and Helen were placed on administrative leave. The partners voted unanimously to initiate termination proceedings. What shocked me more was when Lillian mentioned that ethics complaints were already being drafted for the state bar. The kind of complaints that don't just stain reputations, they erase them. When I heard the news, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't smile. I just sat down at my kitchen table, the same one I'd use to help Mason with algebra, and let it sink in that the people who had tried to reduce my life to a joke were finally being seen for what they really were. Grace resigned. She walked into that same tower her parents once ruled and handed in a letter that reportedly stunned every partner in the room. She didn't just leave. She left with purpose. She announced her intention to start a private practice, focused entirely on labor rights and workplace discrimination. When Mason told me about it, I didn't know what to say. Then he said her first client was the janitorial and maintenance crew at the machine plant, where I've worked the past 30 years. Men and women who've been underpaid, overlooked, and ignored. Grace, the daughter of Helen Whitmore, now fighting for the people her parents never even saw. As for Douglas and Helen, the fallout spread like wildfire. Social invitations stopped. Boards and foundations quietly removed their names. The kind of people who once shook their hands and toasted their anniversaries now acted like they'd never met them. I saw Helen's face in a local paper one morning at the gas station. The headline read, "Disgraced power couple accused of corporate misconduct." I folded the paper and left it on the counter. I didn't need it. Meanwhile, Mason's company exploded, not just in profits, but in recognition. The story of what happened at the wedding got out. Somehow, it always does. And instead of harming him, it revealed exactly the kind of man he is. Honest, relentless, loyal. He signed 3 new contracts within a week, including one from Lillian Brooks' own firm. She said she'd never seen a founder fight so fiercely for his values. She said integrity, like his, was rare in business, and even rarer when inherited. For me, life didn't change much on the surface. I still live above the hardware store. I still lace up boots with more stitches than leather. But the stares I get when I walk into a room now feel different. People nod. They speak to me with something closer to respect than pity. And every time someone calls me Mr. Dawson with a tone I've never heard before, I remember the words on that wedding card. Low-educated factory worker. Not real dad. They meant it to humiliate me. Instead, it became a badge of honor. Not because it was true, but because I stood tall in spite of it. Because my son knew better. And because, in the end, everyone else did too. 3 weeks after the disaster that should have been Mason's wedding, we gathered in Chuck's backyard instead. No tuxedos, no string quartets, no catered 5-course meals. Just about 40 people who mattered. Lawn chairs and folding tables, paper lanterns strung between trees, and the smell of barbecue drifting through the air like something familiar and good. Grace wore a simple dress with no train, no diamonds, just a smile that looked honest this time. Mason looked lighter, like he could finally breathe. There were no photographers buzzing around, no clipboard ladies directing anyone. Just us, and it felt right in a way that the estate never could. My brother Chuck smoked ribs all morning, and Grace helped shuck corn while still in her slippers. The babysitter who'd watched Mason when he was just a toddler baked the wedding cake. 3 slightly uneven tiers, lopsided frosting, and a tiny plastic couple on top that didn't quite match, but it was beautiful in its own way. People laughed, passed around lemonade, and Mason walked down the aisle through rows of old neighbors and friends who had seen him grow up from scraped knees to startups. No show, just soul. When he gave his speech, I couldn't look at him without feeling my throat close up. He thanked Chuck and the neighbors and the old woman who brought deviled eggs. But then he turned to me, and everything else faded. He said I was the reason he knew how to stand on his own, the reason he understood love didn't need money or degrees or the approval of anyone in a tower. He said I gave him a life when I had no reason to believe anyone would give me one. Grace stood beside him with tears in her eyes. When she spoke, her voice cracked. She said she was sorry, genuinely sorry, not just for what her parents did, but for not seeing it sooner. She looked at me and said, "You are, and always were his father. And I hope you can forgive me for not saying that before." Her parents didn't show. No surprise. Their seats stayed empty, and no one missed them. After the vows, people danced barefoot in the grass, and Grace called me Dad for the first time, softly, like she was trying the word out in her mouth. She handed me a plate of potato salad and said, "Here, Dad, before the boys eat it all." I didn't say anything, just nodded and took it, but I don't think she knows what that moment did to me. A few weeks later, Mason and Grace moved into a modest house 2 blocks down from my apartment, above the hardware store. Not a mansion, not a penthouse, just a cozy place with a small porch and a mailbox that stuck a little. The kind of place where real life happens. Some nights, they'd drop by unannounced with takeout and sit on the floor while we watched old westerns. Grace started talking about work, cases, factory conditions, new clients. She lit up every time she talked about someone she could help. It didn't take long before I stopped thinking of her as someone from the other side of the tracks. The nameplate, the one that called me low-educated factory worker. Not real Dad. I kept it, not out of pain, but because it reminded me of what we walked through to get here. It sits in the bottom of my toolbox now, right next to an old Father's Day card Mason gave me when he was 8. Crayon scribbled, the corners bent, but still easy to read. Best dad ever. And then one morning, Mason came over and sat me down. He looked nervous, but there was a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Grace stood beside him, holding her stomach. That's when he told me I was going to be a grandpa. I didn't say anything at first, just stared at the two of them like I was trying to memorize their faces in that exact second. Then Mason leaned in, gripped my shoulder, and said, "I already know what kind of father I want to be." I had the perfect example.